essentially, is where slums are is not random, and people have moved there for one reason, or you might believe that they did it for one reason. And so moving people and offer them a much better house might be worse for these people. And I start to think about that many years ago when, again, my co-author Paul Gertler was working with, I think, I don't remember, but in Mexico, with the government of Mexico, evaluating a program the government of Mexico did, which was called Mi Casa, or Tu Casa. And that program was basically very interesting because essentially what the government was doing was giving the possibility to poor, but not that poor households, to make some payment in advance and then get a house which was 2 rooms, kitchen and bathroom, and enough land to build a much larger house. And then they tell these households that if in 5 years they build the whole house, they will get the title. Okay? And the evaluation we got involved was retrospective. It was not that we could design an optimal evaluation. So we went through possible administrative rules to figure out a control group. We came with some ideas, okay? And then we went to collect the data, and 50% of the treated families have abandoned the new house after a year. And nothing predicts that attrition. So it was hard to do something, so you might not find a paper out there. But it was telling something important, is that even though these families pay a non-negligible amount of money, after experiencing, they abandon the house. And so I kept thinking that there might was something about location, and that there could be a good reason for why some poor families choose to live in very bad conditions, but near to labor markets in slums. Okay, and that's something that we are not going to understand in this paper. We are going to start to say some things about that, but it has to be an important line of research. The reason it's hard to understand, when you go to slum, they are already there, right? There's nothing to study about the location decision. But we have interesting data to say some features of this population compared to other poor population, and see if we can understand the results, okay? Obviously, housing is really important. It's by United Nations one of the most important dimensions on which people should have rights. But then when you go to evaluate housing programs, what do you evaluate, right? So what people evaluate, what should be the main outcome? And if you look at the literature, which is very tiny, at least the well-identified literature, it seems to be health, right? That essentially should be the main outcome of housing projects. I find that struggling because for several reasons, but housing seems to be something that goes much beyond health. For example, housing is one of the largest expenditures that the family makes. It is also classified as a superior good in as much as the world over, the share of income spent on housing increased disproportionately as income rises. The way is that essentially, if you think about housing, it's the place the family interacts, and it has to be very important for that interaction. So I don't have a good answer on how to measure outcomes, but it turns out that there was 2 papers before ours that argue that essentially, well, actually I'm author of one, right? Catania et al. is a paper by me as well. And then there's this paper by Duflo that that one thing that seems to happen consistently, well, by consistently I'm just saying 2 papers, or maybe three papers if you take MTO, in this is that the people seems to be happier with their life and with their houses. And so we are going to look at that outcome in particularly as a way to sort of, in the time being where no one really have thought on better ways to measure these family interactions and the way life improves, summary of well-being outcomes that are, obviously we're going to look at other outcomes, but that will be an important part, life satisfaction. So obviously then housing might affect health among the poor because, as I say, in the population at large, health is not really much related to the house, but in particular in these poor populations where they might be in contact with their floors, it might affect, so their floor is a transmission of parasites, and so it might affect parasite contagion, and that's what we show in Catania et al., at least for certain types of parasites, not for all, but for some that are more likely or very likely to be transmitted through their floors, and that could affect their health, okay, through a channel that might go through diarrhea and anemia. It might also affect respiratory diseases if there's no good ventilation. So we're also going to look at that in this paper. And then housing provides or might provide security and serves as a defense against crime, which is a major problem in slums. And that having proper housing may allow households to accumulate assets. Actually, also the fact that you receive this treatment, which is a better house, might be complementary to your investment decisions, and that might also lead to accumulation of assets. Okay, and also it may free some time, maybe, I don't know that, but there was some work suggesting that in the development literature, so we'll also look at that if there's some effects on the labor market. So what we did is we partnered with an NGO that's been improving houses in slums through Latin America called Un Techo para Mi País. They never evaluated their intervention, and they agreed to do a randomized evaluation with us in 3 countries. Okay, and so we're going to look at the effects country by country, and also we're going to pool all the countries together as a way to sort of show summary. Well, that was the idea. At the end, we want to say something that is kind of robust, right? You might find something in one country, not in another. The typical discussion that we have yesterday was the externality. It turns out that it doesn't make much of a difference because we find more or less nothing in most outcomes, and when we find something in some outcomes, the effects are large in the 3 countries, with the exception of diarrhea, where there's something in 2 countries but not in 1. So it might not make much of a difference anyway, or some difference, but not that large. So what Techo does is they go to very poor settlements, slums in Latin America, and they build houses. Well, I'm going to skip the literature review. I'm just going to summarize like this. They build houses like this. So you see, maybe this is a picture of the house they build, and here you may see some room that might be the kitchen of the bathroom from the previous house this family had. So essentially they just built this one room, 18 square meters, with ventilation and isolated from their floors. But then the isolation is not complete, right? Because you still have their floors around the house. So it's not obvious that you really remove the transmission of parasites that we mentioned in the introduction. And then also it still is the case that you will have the bathroom or kitchen or whatever, maybe outside that room, and that may depend on the size of the land. Or they build you this house, which is essentially the same, but of a different material, and that's what they did in Mexico and Uruguay. And the material, I don't think you make a difference. They just build the material that is best for the weather they are facing. So these houses essentially are very cheap because they're built by voluntary people, right? Obviously, you might say, oh, what's the type of opportunity time? I think all, they are voluntary, so basically they enjoy doing it. They get utility. They don't have to be discounted. know a lot of people that go for a weekend to build a house, and they're really, really happy about that. So mostly it's middle upper class students that goes to do this. But they cost $1,000 in materials. And so Techo asked the families to contribute 10%, okay? So they have to put $100. Okay, so we randomize then who gets the house and who doesn't within each settlement, okay? Well, randomization within settlement is a bit tricky because you have to adjust to the program design, right? So they agreed to randomize, but they didn't agree to restrain access to households when they could construct households. So, for example, if you go to a camp, they sort of first do a survey of all the families, and then they have a cutoff. Those above the cutoff are not eligible. Those below the cutoff are eligible. So let's say they have 50 below the cutoff, and they have voluntaries and material for 35. They will say, okay, randomize the 35 treatments and 15 controls. So you cannot do a design where essentially you're going to have the same number of treated households in each settlement, right? So what is true is that you have randomization within settlement, but not across settlements. So you need to do all the analysis with settlement fixed effects. Also, in each country, they basically didn't have the capacity to do everything at once, so they basically constructed in two phases, okay? And the phases are camps, right? They didn't do like some in one camp, then they moved to another camp, they came back, okay? So there's a difference between 7 and 10 months, between 7 and 10 months difference of when people got treated, but we do the follow-up at the same point for everyone because there was no money to do 2 follow-ups. So that basically means that on average we get people like 18 months after treatment. So some are like 12 months and some are like more like 25. But that's okay. We can look at the average. But then it creates some interesting non-experimental variability. It's not experimental. You have to be careful about that, right? You have to be careful. I'm going to exploit it slightly for something that I find extremely interesting, but it has to be very careful because there's no random, and even if it were random timing of the camps, you are randomizing then in a small sample, right? You're randomizing the order of 20 camps, that kind of thing. You can't really hope that necessarily will be comparable. We talked yesterday too much about internal validity, external validity. When we did this paper, we thought, look, if we go to one country, we only do one country, people will say, fine, it's just one country, so this is something can be extrapolated or not. So we tell them, you work in Latin America, let's take 3 countries. Obviously, the 3 countries are not randomly taken from countries because they already done Chile. They are not doing anything in Chile. But from the countries you're going to be building in the next 5 years, essentially we took 3 that were more or less Mexico, Salvador, and Uruguay at different geographics and different income levels, okay? So well, this gonna essentially be difficult because I don't have much time. So let me sort of give you an overview of what we do in the paper. Okay, we have households, individuals in each country. You see, we don't have that large number of households or individuals in each country, so that's another reason to pool at the end the three countries. We have very low attrition rate. It's balanced, but very low. And in terms of compliance, essentially compliance in the control group is perfect. It's pretty much 100%. In one case it's 99%, so maybe one household that got treated when it should have not. But in the treatment group it's not perfect. It's like 90%, 86%. And that makes sense because people have to pay $100 and some might not have paid or whatever. But still, it's very high. So doing IB will not make much of a difference. So we do intention to treat, to not just make it, the paper, full. There's too many tables already. Okay? And then one thing that is you don't see it, but it's kind of an outcome is part of the attrition is people that move. Part is not. In part because part is people that didn't answer the follow-up. But the rates are more or less the same because we sort of track some of the movers. Well, we track all of them. We find some, so it's a kind of compensate. But the interesting thing about the probability of moving is that it's not statistically different, but consistently is 1 percentage point higher in the control group, right? So I don't know. So, but Techo was worried about this, right? If you see what they do, they essentially don't want people to stay in the slum just because they did this improvement in the house. They will see that as a bad side outcome of improving their life in the short term. So then they have these other treatments to help them to move, but those treatments did not occur in the period of study in these areas. Let's just trust me that we took all the variables that appear in the paper, checked for balance for all countries, and it's very, very well balanced. In like 1 or 2 or 3 at the most are unbalanced in one country, but it's never about 10% of the variables. Okay, so for example, in this table, there's only one unbalance out of like more than 20. This keeps going for the same country. So we tested all the variables that are in the paper. Here there's no other variable. Well, yeah, one there. So it's 2. That's El Salvador, then the same for Uruguay, and then the same for Mexico. And then, if you really randomize it, they should be balanced. So we should not even be testing this. Right? It's by design true. But I still think it's worth testing. Yeah? It's worth putting the p-value because it's not like you are doing this in a controlled setup and these things can go wrong anyway. Then another important thing is that it's hard to do something with perfect in the sense that you want to say, okay, I'm going to do the same intervention and then I'm going to look and see if I have external validity, and that's a great thing to do. But then no causal effect is defined without reference to the counterfactual. So you do the same treatment, but the counterfactual still is not the same. Houses in Uruguay, in the counterfactual, were comparable to Mexico, but not to El Salvador. El Salvador is much poorer, so people start from a worse situation. You get the same treatment, or relative to the control group, is a larger treatment. Whether that ends up having a difference or not is a different question, but that's what this table is supposed to show you, is that El Salvador was worse in terms of almost everything when you look at the baseline. Okay? While in Mexico, there were some differences, but no clear signs. So you can think that the treatment there is more or less going in the same. It's going to be similar. Then I'm not going to go through this. We have a long section trying to understand this population, right? Again, to make something out of the evaluation that helps to think about policies. And we find an interesting result. So what we did is we go to the household surveys and look at the poor, right? And then we compare the poor with the poor in the slums. Obviously, you might say, well, among the poor in the household surveys, you have some people in the slums, but there are not that many in general, because they're not totally representative household surveys. They find hard to go to slums. But in any event, for Uruguay, we have in this household survey, we have identified slums and non-slums, so we can do it for Uruguay perfectly without noise. And what we find is something interesting. We find that not for El Salvador, which is more rural, but yes, for Mexico, and Mexico is DF, it's all in the DF. Uruguay is all in Montevideo, so it's very, very urban. We find that if you look at the human capital of the poor in the slums and in the poor in the non-slums are similar. So, for example, the education of the head of the household, things like that are similar. But then the employment rates are similar, but then there's two differences that are very interesting. One is the houses are much worse in the slums than for the poor in the non-slum. The wages and the patterns of employment are different. So in the slums, people tend to be self-employees, or more, not tends to be, are more likely to be self-employees and get an average wage that is larger. In the paper, we obviously contracted firms, right, to do the survey. We didn't want to be associated with the evaluation because that could create problems. Yeah. Well, these are slums that Techo classifies. So this NGO basically goes through districts and do their evaluation of areas, and they get to say, okay, these are slums. So slums per se are not well defined anywhere, right? When you look at all the habitat studies, they have this loose definition. You don't have to have one of 5 things like water, poor conditions, not electricity, but there's a mix of things. So they sort of say, these are slums, we're going to work in these slums. And then they also say, we are only going to help people in the slum below certain cutoff when they do their scores, looking at observable characteristics of the household. So it's all driven by what the NGO does. So in a way, we think that there is some descriptive evidence that in the more urban areas, some poor, right, with sort of same human capital, select into either living closer to where they can their human capital as self-employees and get some larger wages, but then live in workhouses. That might be, well, why you are spending time on this? But first of all, because as I say, I was interested from previous thinking about this, and I have to have the data available. But second, because it might help to understand some results. So if that were true, in a way, you are looking at the population that self-select into living in worse houses that they could otherwise, and that reveals something about their preference for this treatment or for keep improving the house, okay? That's the idea. Then we look at these satisfactions variables that are a table where we first show how much the houses improve. So essentially, when you look at like the quality of the floor, the quality of the walls, the number of rooms, and so on and so forth, that is essentially with the treatment you see large effects. Okay, that's nothing. I'm not claiming that's obvious, right? It is treated, but after 2 years, maybe the control group build themselves. So it's worth just checking. But what was important in that table is that when you look at all possible complementarity investment, we find nothing there. So there were no any different investment by the family after a year and a half. Maybe later they do it, but after a year and a half. On improving their houses as a complementary investment. This is the same everywhere, and not surprisingly, all the effects are larger in El Salvador than in Uruguay and Mexico, but much larger, right? For example, if you ask how much satisfies you are with the quality of something, the floor or the walls, the increases in Salvador are 300%, while in Mexico are 30%. The point estimates are larger, but also the initial conditions are lower. So the two things magnify, right? And you get this effect. And that is what I was referring, that the treatment is the same, but the counterfactual in El Salvador is different from Mexico and Uruguay, so you will expect to see much larger effects. Now, if you look at this literature on called happiness or life satisfaction and so on and so forth, for example, Angus Deaton just published this very nice paper about the escape of whatever. I don't remember, but it's a very nice book. And he said, well, it's very important to check that these measures of life satisfaction correlates with health, with income, and they correlate. But there is this idea that people adapt, right? Adapt. So, for example, if I give you, so suppose you go shopping this afternoon and you get a lot of stuff you don't have, you're really happy. So now your income goes up and you start going shopping every other day. After a month, you're not really much happier by doing that. It's just if you ask people, they will say, yeah, my life's going like normal. Right? So what I wanted to do is to see how much of these effects survive over time. And what I will do is to exploit this fact that some people was treated by between 7 and 10 months after other, okay? But I want to be sure that this is done rigorously. So I want to essentially be sure that, first of all, be something I haven't checked before. I have balance on all these outcomes by phase of the treatment, okay? By phase. But also that on average phase 1 and phase 2 are also balanced, because if the difference between phase 1 and phase 2, so suppose phase 2 were more happy, right? Then the coefficients will be different when I test whether the coefficients are equal, but that means it can be really interpreted. And this is hard because essentially we didn't randomize this, right? And as I say, even if you randomize, it's a small sample issue. So the truth is that if you do it country by country, they are not really that well balanced, phase 1 and phase 2. And that, I think, is a small sample issue. So, but if you do it for the pool, it's all balanced. So I'm going to show you this result for the pool. But don't think that if I do it country by country anyway, I find different results, and now I'm just trying to say, okay, let's do a pool. No, you find this in every country. It's just that I think it's the right way to do it is in the pool sample, okay? And what we find is very interesting is that all the effects, right, are reduced by a half after a year, right? So now, what's going to happen in 5 years, I don't know, and I will maybe never know, but that's really interesting. So still, then, if you see here, I still test whether the effects survive, right? Because essentially what I'm reporting here is the effect of being treated, and then here I'm reporting the effect of being treated in the phase 1. So you see, this was the total effect. This is what disappeared, and you see it's kind of 0.28, 0.11, so it's for like 40% of the effect goes away. But still, if I say, okay, are these guys still more happy or whatever is the variable? Yeah, they are, right? And so essentially, after 2 years, they still are happier with the dimensions of the house, and they are happier with the quality of life, but are half what they are a year before, right? And that is really interesting evidence of this adaptation. Essentially, these houses, which are aluminum, will not deteriorate for years, but we don't have like, you need to have like satellite. It will be very difficult to look this deterioration of 6 months on aluminum by someone looking at the house. Okay. So then we look at effects on satisfaction. No, on effect on satisfaction, perception. Well, whatever. We asked about how people safe inside the house, leaving the kids in the house, blah blah blah, and whether they suffer crime. There's no difference in crime at all. And only in El Salvador we find that people felt more secure, okay? So that might be rationalized by the fact that they started with workhouses. It could be that, for example, now they feel more secure to leave a kid inside the house compared to the counterpart. But the rules of the game were looking for robust effects across countries, so still here we don't have that, okay? Effects on asset accumulation. This will be different from investment in the house. Investment will be water, sanitation, other stuff that is in the missing table, which is in the paper, right? I just was editing the slides after 3 pisco sour, and it was not the more wise decision in my life. So we look at assets, nothing. And then we look at kind of household side, income, labor, nothing. And then when we look at child health, on respiratory disease, we find nothing. And then on the diarrhea, it's hard to say, because essentially, if you look at the point estimates for El Salvador and Mexico are very large, right? You find decreases of 20%, 30%, which are really, really large. But we don't have power. We essentially have very large standard errors, because remember that we have like 400 households, and we didn't power for diarrhea. We didn't only sample families with children below 5. We basically studied the families that receive the treatment, whether they have children or not, or things like that. So when you go to the pool regression, which is within the rules of the game, we get this decrease of 15%, and with a p-value of 17. So still is not significant. Okay? But then, and that's the conclusion. Still not significant. But then you have to tell people something more, because at least for me, that I have another paper where find a decrease in diarrhea of 8%, and it's significant only because they have 3,000 children, right? So in a way, it's precision. So, but then what is interesting here is that in Uruguay, there's no effect. In this, I forgot to say, Uruguay was really much better being in Montevideo in terms of water and sanitation and that kind of thing. And so we look at El Salvador and Mexico, where the action is, and then we find significance at the 10%. But the conclusion is that essentially we are underpowered to detect this effect. But we cannot say there's nothing, because that will not be responsible, given that here you have point estimates going in the same direction, which are large, right? So that's the situation there. In conclusion, what I wanted to say is that in situ upgrading still remains a valid policy choice, although we don't have many effects. This intervention is very, very small, right? only $1,000, and there's no evidence that moving people outside these slums yet are more cost effective in some dimension. And second, what I think is will be important, and Techo, and this is one case in which essentially an evaluation is being used. Techo is now considering whether they should upgrade the house in terms of whether they should do sanitation or water or redesign the kitchen or something to see if they could really get larger health effects or although the effects were not smaller, the thing was maybe underpowered. I guess I finished.
So I'm not going to present the slides because I have only a few comments. The paper is very good. The methodology is, I think, there's nothing to say. So what I'm going to say are not comments in the traditional way that says, okay, this is wrong, you can go in this direction or not. Because what the paper does ask, the answer is there. I'm just going to mention a couple of things that came to my mind when I read the paper. On the one hand, it's about results, and on the one hand, it's about the method. With respect to results, half of what I have to say, Sebastian mentioned, it was not in the paper, it was adaptation, but let me add something else about this. The outcomes that he studies can be divided in two groups. Those that are objective and those that are subjective. Objectives are those that can be measured, like hours of work, assets, and so on. And subjective are others, like what you think, how you feel, and so on. Right? So usually when I read papers like this, I always wonder how people answer that. How do you say, how satisfied are you with the house or whatever? And it's usually in relative terms and not in absolute terms. You made a point very clear. So what is in relation to what? So what the theory says is that you need a benchmark. It's not like an absolute way to compare. And the benchmark are two candidates. One of them is you in the past. So if you try new food, you say, well, I rank this very high in terms of preferences because I have tried Burger King, which is not very good, right? So this is the idea of habit formation, which is related to adaptation, as you mentioned. So there's nothing wrong here with doing this because the difference is between short run and long run. So what you're estimating in the short run, you don't know the long run. But let me add something else. There is another benchmark in the literature that is comparing you with some other people. And this is what macro people said, keep up with the Jones. Is the how good or bad you feel about your consumption depending on how other people consume. Right? So if your neighbors bought a new house, you feel miserable. Right? So, and this problem, if you live in habit, this is called external habit formation. Internal habit formation is when it's you and you in the past. But external habit formation is comparing your utility with what you consume with what other people consume. If you believe in external habit formation, then it poses some problems to identification. Why? Let's assume that I did not, in the randomization, I did not get the house. My neighbors got the house. Then they asked me, how do you feel about your house? I think it's crappy. Right? Why? Because now I see that the neighbors has a better house. From an econometric point of view, this means that the stable treatment units analysis is violated, in the sense that the treatment should not affect the untreated. And this is creating an externality. I'm not saying that this is what's happening to you. This is something that came to my mind when I read the paper. So this is with respect to result.
Yeah, we thought about that, and we thought the only way we can say something is to just notice that if you compare the results in the baseline and
exactly.
There's no difference.
Okay, that's perfect. That's perfect. Because I didn't see that in the paper. That the idea is you can do the before treatment. There should be nothing.
No, I think maybe this I submitted the paper many months ago. I forgot to update the paper.
No, it's just something that came to my mind. Then the other thing is with respect to methods. And it's when I read in the abstract about external validity, something that was discussed yesterday, this was in my mind for the entire paper and was trying to browse where the explanation was. And it was just one paragraph. I would like to see more. And the reason is that if there is something I take from this conference is that there is very little that I know personally from external validity. But also, I think that the concept is usually mentioned without much precision. And in my opinion, when you don't put a lot of precision, it becomes like an empty concept. In the sense, not in your paper, I'm talking more like in general. For instance, external validity is when you can apply the conclusions of the paper to another setting or environment. This is very general, but for instance, first, what do we mean by another environment? I mean, it's in a different country, in a different region, in the world. If you think that this has external validity to the world, it means that, well, you are estimating what Lucas says, the deep parameters of the model or something like this. So I think it has to be external with respect to what? The other issue is the results. And what do we mean by result? Do we mean that if it's significant, or are we talking about, in econometric thing, the point estimating? The 3.5 is applied to everywhere or not? Because if it's like this, well, in El Salvador it's different, so you can see that there is a violation too, if this is the concept. And then the other thing is that different environment usually would consider different countries. But, I mean, if you think twice, why can't you just say different environment, different settings? Well, you may think, well, because countries are more different in terms of social norm, in terms of law, in terms of whatever. But what you have in mind is a concept of distance in the environment that is not completely clear. So all those things, I mean, I just want to stop here. The conclusion is that basically I know very little about external validity, but in most of the paper we put very explicit all the assumptions to do internal validity. Right? We do whatever method we do. We specify if it's local treatment effect, average treatment effect, what are the assumptions that we make. But then when we move to external validity, I mean, you need much more stronger assumptions. And there is not in the papers. So this is the part that, no, it's not about your paper. It's something that in general, I think that...
I just wanted to go back to the slides and read my thoughts.
Sure. Just to conclude is, part of what I'm saying external validity, I assume that is because it's my ignorance, because I usually focus on internal validity, thinking that external validity you need heroic assumptions, but I would like to say it's not about the paper, it's just...
You're right, there's only one or two paragraphs in the paper about that, and those are the ones wisely I added to the slide today. So let me... I think we don't know a lot, right? That's the thing. We are trying to learn what to do about external validity. So essentially, the people that talk about this originally was Campbell, as I say yesterday, right? So any causal study must overcome both internal and external threat to validity, right? Most research is focused on dealing with threats. This is what's in the paper, right? The threats to internal validity. Then ultimately, external validity, this is the view we are having right now. For example, if you read Angry's 2004 in the Economic Journal, which is a paper about external validity. Ultimate external validity is established by replication in multiple data sets drawn from a variety of settings. And the idea is basically not that much the point estimate, but the direction of the effects being comparable, and that's the way we say it. And if you read this article, which is based on paper, How Science Goes Wrong, it's all about the fact that in many disciplines it's impossible to replicate one experimental result. So in psychology, for example, all this priming thing that you prime people, well, I don't remember. There's full of examples here. So you do an experiment, then someone tries to replicate, it can't. And so in that sense, I think I'm not arguing much. I'm saying, look, we could do it in 3 countries. Then you say, oh, there's many dimensions to this. There's not only countries, there is space, there's might be geography. Yeah, if I could do 1,000 experiments, or I will be stronger in the conclusions, but we're never going to do that, never. So here we have to live with a bit of saying, like always we did in economics, right? Before we used to do experiments, we believe in results that were kind of robust, right? Robust to different specifications, where this is like going into that direction. That's all I can say.